everyone, it's Christina from Sheridan Art and Designs here with you today. Today I want to talk you through 3 different collar modifications, and it'll be 3 different levels of difficulty or amount of work that has to go into each. So I'll walk you through each one, and then you can decide which technique will work best for the pattern that you're working on for your project. So before we get started, I just want to get some supplies together. So the first thing you need is a pencil, and then you will also need a straight edge ruler and a curved ruler. If you're going to do a lot of pattern modifications, I definitely recommend getting a curved ruler. It speeds up the process a lot, and it makes sure that your curves that you draw, whether it's on the left or right or front and back, that they're the same on both pieces of a pattern if they need to match. So a curved ruler is definitely worth the investment. And then the other thing is some tissue paper. You can get it on a roll like this from Amazon, and it's really useful to have it on the roll because then you can just roll out as much as you need and you don't have to like tape individual sheets of tissue paper together. But tissue paper of some kind, and of course you'll need scissors. So other than that, that's all you'll need. So let's get started. The first level of pattern modification that I want to show you today for a collar is for this pattern right here. You may have seen it in one of our other videos, but the collar on this was actually a traditional fold over collar. And for the cosplay I was doing with it, I needed a stand collar. So the first level of modification basically just involves knowing which pieces of the pattern you need versus the pieces that they provide you, right? So the beauty of this collar here was that it came in 2 pieces. One was that under part, the stand collar, and then the other part was the part that folded over to make what we think of as a collar, right? The fold over part. So when I looked at the instructions for this and the list of pieces that it gives you, I just made sure that I cut out the collar stand piece and not the collar piece. So the collar stand piece looks like this, and it's that part underneath that stands straight up that connects to the neck, not the part that folds over. So because I just wanted this collar to stand up, all I needed was this one piece, and I disregarded the other pieces. And I didn't change anything about this except that I finished the edge here, whereas normally you would attach this edge to the other piece that folds over. This, I just sewed my 2 pieces right sides together and then flipped them out to have a finished edge there, and then attached it to the coat according to directions. So keep that in mind when you're looking at patterns. If something maybe is a little bit extra than what you're looking for, you can pare that down and just get the pieces that you need out of it, and no one will know that there was like extra pieces that you didn't cut out. So that's level 1. It requires almost no modification except for a little bit of know-how as far as the pieces are concerned. So level 2 involves this pattern right here. This is the pattern that we're using for our Evil Queen cosplay that's coming up. I just started modifying it last week, and I realized that the collar needed some changes to it. But what I didn't do on this pattern was change the construction of how the pieces go together. So that'll save you a lot of time and energy if you can save the lines of the pattern where those pieces go together. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So for this piece, for this pattern, the collar had 2 different pieces to it. So it had this like what they called the front facing. So that would go like this, right? So it's the front part of this collar. And then it has this piece, which is the back collar. So that's the back piece that goes here. So as you can see on the pattern, it's the front facing piece. That piece that comes in the front is this piece. And then the piece that wraps around the neck, that's this piece. So I took those 2 pieces out, and I initially always start by tracing the pattern piece as they come in the pattern, just so I know exactly what I'm looking at and what shape I already have to begin with. So then once I am here and I decide, okay, well, I don't like this outer shape here, which would be the shape of the outside of the collar, right? It's gonna be this shape here, right? The outside of the collar piece there, not the part that attaches to the actual coat, right? So I know that I can keep most of this pattern piece. So this piece, this line right here, attaches to the front of the coat. So I know that I don't need to change anything about that because I'm fine with how that attaches to the coat. So I leave that line intact. I'm also okay with the length of this. So I don't have to bring this line up or down or change it at all. I can keep this piece. The parts of this pattern that I'm going to change are this piece on the outside. I'm going to reshape that. And then this piece right here is what attaches to the back collar piece, right? So you would match your notches up right here. And I know that I need this collar piece to be bigger. So we're gonna change this to match the new collar piece. So I'll show you exactly how we do that. The first thing, since this one is smaller, I'll just show you really quick how we did that. So the only change we made on this piece was I raised this edge up because I needed it to be taller in the back, right? So this is my modified piece. And all I did was I took the original piece and I just extended it up. So I wanted to make sure that this line here, this is where it attaches to the neckline of the coat in the back. So I wanted to leave that the same so that I knew that this piece would attach to that back piece of your pattern without any problems. So I left this alone, and then I even left these sides alone where it was cut on the fold, just so I knew that everything would go to the other pieces respectively the same. And then all I did was extend this line up a little bit. So once I have that done, I can now come over to my front facing piece. And all I do to change these is I lay the original piece down on my table, and then I take my tracing paper and I roll it out on top of that pattern piece so that you can see the original pattern piece through the tracing paper. And then I just take my rulers and I start by tracing out the pieces that I'm gonna keep the same. So like I said, I'm okay with that front attachment piece and I'm okay with the length. So I know that I can just trace those pieces out, right? So that's this line here. I can leave that. So I'm just following the original pattern piece that I can see through my tracing paper right now. And then I'm okay with this line here, which is that front attachment line. So I can just trace that piece in too. I can take my little curve ruler and match the curves on it. That's why the curved ruler really is great, because it just makes it easier. Instead of like trying to freehand it, you can just line it up, and then you can kind of switch between the two if it's like a bit of a straight and then a bit of a curve. You just match that up. And then there we go. I have my pieces that I'm keeping the same. And then I even know on this outer piece, because I pinned those pieces together and kind of held it up on my mannequin and looked at it, I know that this lower part, which would be here, this lower part, I'm gonna keep the same. So I can trace that in as well. So I'm just gonna trace that bottom bit in right here. Now there's a notch on this piece, so I wanna make sure that I'm keeping my notches and all my markings because those correlate to the other pieces, right? So you wanna make sure that you still know where everything goes. Oops, moving stuff around. So then I can kind of come up to the point where I'm like, okay, I definitely wanna change that, right? And then I can change this outer edge where I get to trace. I can change that any way I want. I can make that any shape I want. I know that I want to kind of bring that curve down a little bit. I want to move it in a little bit. And then I also have to extend this piece out because I extended the back collar piece. So I have to match this side with this piece, right? So I'll show you what I finished. So then you would just trace that out and cut it out. and I'll show you the comparison. So this was the original pattern piece, and then this is the one that I made. So you can see they're pretty close, but there are some changes to it. So I'll even match them up for you. So this is the side we said we were keeping the same, and down here too. So you can see like those notches match. They're the same size. These notches match, right? Because I didn't have to change anything about this lower section. What I did want to change is this outer curve. So I'll put this in front so you can see it. So what I did was I just took this line and I moved it in a little bit on this new piece, right? And then the only other thing that I changed is I brought it up so that it's going to meet that new back collar piece, right? All of this I left the same, even this notch here, so that it matches my collar piece and attaches in the same way. And then I just take my back collar piece, my new one, and you can see how it matches my notch and my notch, right? We're matching our notches. And then you can see how it ends in the same place, right? So we're gonna overlap for our seam allowance here. And I match my notches. And so those are the same, right? So those are all gonna come together at the same level. They don't look like this, right? So I want them to look like this. Now, if after you change some pieces, you're really not sure if you did it right or if they're gonna go together smoothly, what I always recommend is cut them out and pin them together to see if they go together. But if you're still not sure, cut them out of some scrap material or some muslin so that you can see how those pieces go together in fabric. And you can just pin them together, or you can actually sew them together so you get a feel for how much of the seam allowance is gonna take up and all of that. So if you look right over here, you can see I cut those new pieces and I kind of put them on my dress form so that I could see what the overall shape is going to be, right? I know that for Evil Queen, if you've seen Once Upon a Time, she has those stand collars, so I know that I want this to stand up and I want it to be mostly dramatic in the back and then kind of taper around to the front, right? So dramatic in the back up here, and then it's tapering around the front. I got rid of some of that large circle out here. I just brought it in and added it to the back over here. Now the rest of this, obviously it's in muslin, so it's not going to stand the same way it will on the finished project, but this shows you the shape that you're going for, so you can get a really good feel for the overall shape when it's done and for how those pieces go together. So if you do something like this and you're still not sure how these pieces will attach, say, to the front or the back, feel free to cut those pieces out too and then do like a whole trial run so that you're really familiar with how those pieces go together and you make sure that all those pieces look exactly like you want them to look before you cut them out of your expensive fabric, right? The other thing you can do when you cut it out of muslin, if there are still some changes that you want to make, you can just take your scissors and actually cut the muslin to the shape that you want. And then you can just put it back on your pattern and trace the new shape onto your pattern piece. That way you get a more visual, like you can actually see it in real time on the dress form, and it can translate down into the pattern piece when you're done with it. So after that, the only other thing you really want to be aware of with a pattern like this, as you can see from the picture, the outside, this collar has an inside and an outside, right? So you're gonna make the lining, you're gonna make a collar piece out of, and then you're also gonna have that same collar piece on the outside that matches the front of the coat. So I took the front piece of this coat and I made sure that I made those changes, and you can see I just taped some extra on. This is the original line, and I just taped it on and traced the new line on it. So you can see how this will match, where's my modified one? This one. This will match this piece, right? So I match my notches here, and my notches here match, and I just changed that shape of that all the way down to here, right? So that they match the same now. And all that took was trimming off, you know, I laid this piece on top of my front piece, I traced the new line, I trimmed it off, and then I taped an extra piece on so that I could get the rest of this where I extended it out. And that's all it took. So now you're ready to just make the coat per the instructions with the slightly modified shape of this piece. The majority of the patterns that I modify go this way. So they don't involve too much like disassembly of instructions and reinventing whole pieces. They just take me looking at the pieces that already are there, and then you just change a line or two, and it can change the whole look of a piece. So you just want to keep that in mind when you're shopping for a pattern. If something's almost there, you can get it all the way there with just a few quick modifications. And this doesn't take too much effort to change. You just need a few trial and errors if you're not used to it. But then once you get quick at it, you can look at a pattern piece and you can say, okay, I know exactly what I need to change about that to be the shape that I want, right? So that moves us to the third level of collar modifications, which is our Cruella collar. You might have seen the pattern. Let's clean this up. You might have seen that pattern in another video, but it's this pattern right here. Now for this coat, like I said, it got us most of the way there, but I didn't like the collar of this, and I needed a much more dramatic collar for our Cruella coat. It needed to be this big furry collar, right? So what I did is I did the same thing I always do. I traced all the original pieces, and then I took a look at them, and in this pattern, unfortunately, unlike this pattern where there is just like a front and a back piece that go together around the neckline, in this one the collar piece came up and attached into that shoulder seam area, and that was not what I wanted, and it made changing the shape of it much more difficult. So what I ended up doing is taking the piece that was like collar, and then this is like a front facing piece which also had a piece of the collar on it, and I just got rid of those pieces, and then I took the front and the back piece, and this shoulder seam, so this is the back piece, this shoulder seam, I just made it match the front shoulder seam, right? So these now match, they're the same length, right? And those notches match. Whereas in the original pattern, they weren't the same length. There was an added piece that went in on the front side. So I just extended this line out so that these match, so that it's a traditional shoulder seam right here. And if you take like your t-shirt or even a button-up shirt, you can see how the front piece and the back piece, that's where they attach right there, right? They're the same length line. And that's all this is. That's that. And then I decided, okay, so now I have my front and my back pieces that are going together, and I'm gonna build a collar on top of that. And since I was building a collar completely from scratch, here's what I did. I took my dress form, let's take Evil Queen off, and then I took a scrap piece of tissue, and I turned my dress form around because I knew I wanted to do the back, but this works for the front as well. I laid my tissue down where that collar piece would go, right? So your collar goes around the neckline, and I just pinned that in place so it was on the dress form, and it covered the area that I knew I was going to want. And then I took my pencil and I just sketched the collar in. So for the Cruella collar, she has this big drapey black collar that goes all the way over, so it takes up most of her shoulder and it goes pretty far down her back, and it's this big dramatic collar. So what I did is I just took, you know, this is the shoulder of your dress form. I knew I wanted it to cover most of that, so I just started there and I sketched down, and I knew I wanted to make it kind of a swoop shape, right, when it was done. So I just sketched in a circular shape like this all the way up, and you want to try and, you know, get them the same on both sides, but it's not really going to matter because you can just cut it down the middle and then cut it on the fold. But you want to make, you know, make your swoop, make your collar shape. And this works out too if it's just right here, right? You would just draw it up here. But this is a big dramatic one, so we're coming all the way down here. And then I take this piece off. I'm going to cut that piece out. And then I have something that looks like this. So this is a half, right? So this is half of this. It lays like this. And then I just wrote here, cut on fold. That way I know that this curve on this side is exactly the same on this side, and I don't have one that's in a little bit and this one's out a little bit, you don't have to worry about drawing the curve perfectly. You just draw it on one side and you use the side you like the best, and then cut it on the fold so that you get both. So that takes care of this. And this, right? Because you just you cut this out, you folded it in half, so that's a straight line down the center back, and then you have your curve on the outside, right? So straight line down the center back and your curve on the outside. Now for these, this is the neck piece where the pattern goes into the neck, and this is the shoulder seam. So strictly speaking, I don't necessarily need to seam the collar there at the shoulder, but it was a good place for me to seam it to the front piece, to like the lapel piece, without it being seen in the front. So it just kind of hides on the shoulder. So I decided to seam it on the shoulder. So what I did was, I laid my new collar piece before I cut it, right? And I knew that this collar goes in the back, right? So I laid it on the back piece. So this is my back piece. This is my new collar piece. I laid it down on top like this, and then I traced the back line. So that means that the back neck and the collar neck will be exactly the same. And I even put in the notch that's on the back where the original collar would have gone to. I put that notch on my collar as well, on my new collar piece, so that I lined it up correctly, right? So like, this is your center back seam on your back piece. This is my center back of my collar. This is my neckline on my back piece. This is my neckline on my collar. And then I also took the angle of the shoulder seam and I seamed that the same way too. You notice it's not as long because the collar isn't going to come to the edge of the shoulder. It's going to come in a little bit, right? So I just traced those off of the back piece, and then I know for certain that when I go to attach this collar to the neck, it's going to match exactly because I copied it straight from the back, right? So now I have the back of a collar and I need the front of a collar now, right? So I did the same thing. I laid the tissue on the front and I traced, sketched out my outside edge, right? The edge that comes this way on your collar. And then I did, so that this piece goes here, right? So I laid a big piece of tissue on my dress form and then I drew this line in. And then the same thing. So this is going to be your center front. This is your neckline. So just like we did on the back piece, here's my front piece. I laid this on top. I matched my center front and I traced that line in, and I matched my neckline and I traced that line in, and then I traced in my shoulder piece, just like that, right? So you're taking from these original pattern pieces that you know you're going to use already, and you match the lines where it attached. So you know collar attaches at the neckline, you know collar is going to attach at the front. So you take those lines from the front and the back pieces. And then all I did, because I knew I was going to have to seam the back collar and the front collar at our shoulder seam, right? So I drew myself my own little notch, right? So that I knew that these pieces matched, if I paste them the right way, these pieces match the right way, right? And then if I pin those together, I can fold this out and I have a whole neckline, right? So this would go just like this on me. And that's how you would construct this from scratch. That's a really easy way of doing it. Just sketch it on the dress form and then make it into pattern pieces. So just to recap, I want to show you on the table so that you can see really quickly. But if I'm laying this down, this is my back piece, right? And I'm making something like this. I would take my tissue off my dress form that I sketched my circle on. I would lay it down on here, right? First I would cut it out, but then I would fold it in half so I found the center back, and I would line up my center back with my center back on my pattern, right? So that's center back. Move it up a little bit. That's center back there. So then you can draw that line in. And then all you're doing is finding this neckline, and you're going to draw that in on your pattern too, and your shoulder seam. And then you can cut out your whole piece. So just like this, right? So center back, neckline, shoulder seam. And then this is the part that I drew on the dress form. And that creates this pattern for you. So you can see that like I taped this together a few times. I wasn't perfect the first time. You know, I would say no one's gonna see your pattern pieces, right? What happens on the pattern is between you and the pattern, right? No one's gonna see it. So don't be afraid of like, oh, I gotta tape that together, or oh, I really messed that line up, or even just scrap it and start over again. Like, it can take you a few tries to get it perfectly right. And the same holds true for this. I did a whole test collar out of my muslin before I was sure and ready to cut this out of my real fabric. So just make sure that you're testing along the way so you don't get frustrated once you've already cut your fashion fabric. The only other thing I would remind you is that your patterns don't have to be 100% perfect to the end result. So the perfect example of this is that front collar piece. And on my end one, I realized I didn't like this angle here. So I actually took my scissors on my finished piece and just trimmed that, right? But I didn't come back to the pattern after I was already constructing and change it. But if you're gonna make multiple of the same thing, you can come back with your finished cutout piece and change your pattern. Just so you remember later what you did or what you changed after you were done with your pattern piece. But you can get most of the way there with the pattern and then change a few things here or there with your finished pattern piece. So there you guys go. That's 3 different techniques, from just not cutting anything out to changing a few lines to constructing a whole new little pattern piece to go onto your existing pattern. I hope this was super helpful. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do other kinds of modifications, and I'll see you in the comments. Thanks, guys.